There is a conversation about the second half of life that our culture almost never has honestly. Not the practical conversation about retirement planning or physical health or the management of aging bodies. Those conversations happen, they are useful in their way. But they are organized entirely around the external dimensions of a period of life that is at its most important level an interior experience. And by focusing almost exclusively on the exterior, they miss the thing that most needs to be understood. The second half of life is not primarily a logistical challenge, it is a psychological one. And for many people, it is also a spiritual one, not in any dogmatic sense, but in the sense that it brings with a specificity and an urgency that the first half of life rarely generates, the questions that matter most. Not what am I achieving, but what am I actually here for? Not what do others think of me, but who am I when the performance finally runs out of audience? Not how do I build the life I was supposed to have, but how do I genuinely inhabit the life I actually have while there is still genuine time to inhabit it? Gabor Maté understood these questions from the inside, not only as a clinician who sat with people in the second half of their lives, though he did that extensively, but as a person who arrived at the midpoint of his own life and discovered with the specific disorientation that genuine self-honesty produces, that significant portions of the life he had been building were organized around things that had very little to do with who he actually was. That the compulsions driving his work, the patterns in his relationships, the specific quality of restlessness that had accompanied his considerable achievements, all of these were pointing not at the failure of his life, but at a self that had never been fully met, never been fully allowed into the life being lived. And what he understood through his own reckoning and through his decades of clinical observation of people navigating exactly this territory is what I want to give you today, not as abstract philosophy, as the specific, honest, practically relevant account of what the second half of life is actually asking for and why most people miss the asking until it arrives too urgently to ignore. The first thing Gabor Maté understood that almost no one says clearly is this: the second half of life begins not with a birthday, but with a question. And the question is almost always uncomfortable. For some people, it arrives as depression, the specific, often treatment-resistant quality of depression that appears in midlife, not from biochemical imbalance alone, but from the genuine accumulating weight of a life that has been organized around the wrong things for long enough that the system can no longer sustain the pretense. For others, it arrives as physical illness. The body, as it so often does in Gabor Maté's framework, delivering the message that the psychology has been managing into silence. For others, it arrives as the sudden hollowness of an achievement that was supposed to feel like a rival, and instead feels like the moment the scaffolding was removed, and what remained was not the solid structure that was anticipated, but a question. A large, unwelcome, genuinely important question. What am I actually doing here? This question, when it genuinely arrives, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a felt, urgent, sometimes frightening recognition that the current organization of the life does not match something essential about who the person actually is the beginning of the second half of life in the psychological sense. And how a person responds to it determines almost everything about what the second half actually produces. The most common response, Gabor Maté observed, is avoidance. Not conscious avoidance, the avoidance of a person who does not yet have the framework to understand what the question is actually asking, who interprets the discomfort of the question as a problem to be solved rather than an invitation to be accepted, who reaches for the familiar strategies, more achievement, more busyness, a different relationship, a different location, a different external arrangement of the circumstances, rather than turning toward the interior territory from which the question is actually arising. These strategies can work temporarily. They can extend the first half of life, its organizing concerns, its primary orientation toward external building and external validation, well past the point where the authentic self has begun to press for something different. But they cannot work permanently. because the question does not go away. It waits with the specific patience of something that knows it is genuinely important. And it tends to return when the avoidance eventually runs out of fuel, with considerably more urgency than it carried the first time. What Gabor Maté understood about the second half of life that almost no one says is that genuine engagement with this question, the willingness to actually sit with it, to allow it to be as large and as uncomfortable as it actually is, rather than immediately moving to manage its discomfort, is not a crisis to be resolved. It is the most important developmental opportunity available to a human being past the midpoint of their life. He drew on the work of Carl Jung in understanding this. Jung believed, and Gabor Maté's clinical observations confirmed, that the second half of life has a genuinely different developmental task than the first. The first half is organized appropriately around the external, around building, achieving, establishing identity and place in the social world, developing the capacities required to function as an autonomous adult human being. These are real and important tasks. They deserve the energy and the focus the first half of life typically gives them. But they are not the only tasks that human life contains. And the person who arrives at the midpoint, having successfully accomplished the first half's external tasks, while having entirely neglected the interior ones, the cultivation of genuine self-knowledge, the honest encounter with what was sealed away in the adaptive process of becoming a functional adult, the development of a relationship with the self that goes deeper than the identity organized around external achievement, that person arrives at the second half of life with a specific and significant deficit. Not a moral deficit, a developmental one. The interior territory that the first half's external focus did not require to be navigated is waiting. And it does not wait passively. It generates the symptoms, the midlife depression, the physical illness, the relationship fractures, the achievement hollowness, the large and unwelcome question, that are its way of making known that the navigation can no longer be deferred. What Gabor Maté understood about this navigation, what he considered essential, and what most accounts of midlife and the second half of life consistently miss, is that it cannot be accomplished through the same strategies that built the first half. The intelligence, discipline, and effortful achievement that constructed the first half's accomplishments are largely inadequate to the second half's actual requirements, not because those capacities are worthless, but because the second half's primary work is not external construction, it is interior descent. And descent requires a different set of capacities than construction. It requires the capacity to sit with uncertainty rather than immediately resolving it. The first half builds certainty, clear goals, clear identities, clear measures of progress. The second half, when it is genuinely engaged with, dismantles much of that certainty and asks the person to navigate from something less clear but more genuinely their own. This is profoundly uncomfortable for people who have organized their sense of competence around their ability to produce clarity and resolution. And it is one of the primary reasons that the second half's genuine invitation is so frequently declined in favor of the more familiar but less genuinely satisfying continuation of the first half's strategies. It requires the willingness to grieve, genuinely, specifically, without the premature spiritualization that converts grief into gratitude before it has been fully felt. The second half of life carries with it, in almost every case, a genuine accumulation of loss. The loss of the possibilities that the first half's choices foreclosed. The loss of the youth that carried those possibilities. Sometimes the loss of specific people and relationships and versions of the self that cannot be recovered. This grief is not morbid, it is honest. And the person who attempts to navigate the second half without genuinely grieving what deserves to be grieved tends to carry that grief forward as a weight that makes the genuine opportunities of the second half harder to access. It requires, perhaps above all, a profound shift in the relationship with time. The first half of life is organized around the future, around what will be achieved, what will be built, what will eventually arrive. The second half, when it is genuinely inhabited, requires a fundamentally different orientation, not the resigned acceptance of someone who has given up on the future, but the genuine, cultivated capacity to be actually present to the life that is happening now, rather than perpetually passing through the present on the way to the future that has always organized the first half's energy. Gabor Maté observed that this shift in the relationship with time is one of the most consistently difficult aspects of the second half's genuine work, and one of the most consistently rewarding when it is genuinely accomplished. The person who has developed the capacity to be genuinely present to their own actual life, to the conversation actually happening, the relationship actually available, the creative impulse actually present, the beauty actually visible in the specific unrepeatable moment they are actually in. That person has access to a quality of experience that the future organized first half self, for all its energy and achievement, rarely permitted. There is something else Gabor Maté understood about the second half of life that deserves particular attention. Something that he approached with a combination of clinical precision and genuine personal honesty that I have found rarely replicated in other accounts of this territory. He understood that the second half of life is, among other things, a confrontation with what was never genuinely faced in the first, the wounds that were managed rather than healed, the shadow material that was sealed rather than integrated, the authentic self that was adapted around rather than genuinely inhabited. These things do not resolve themselves through the passage of time alone. They remain in the interior life of the person who is not genuinely engaged with them, as active and as influential at 60 as they were at 30, often more so, because the compensatory strategies that manage their influence in the first half are gradually, as energy and circumstance change, becoming less effective. In the second half of life, in its most challenging and most ultimately generous aspect, tends to make this confrontation increasingly unavoidable. The children have left home, and the busyness that managed the interior quiet is no longer available. The career has peaked, and the achievement that provided an organizing identity is no longer generating sufficient forward momentum. The body has begun to speak in ways that require attention. The relationships that sustained the first half's patterns are shifting. And in the spaces that open up, as these former organizers of the daily life loosen their grip, the interior territory that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, begins to become impossible to continue deferring. This is not decline. This is the second half's specific and genuinely necessary form of invitation. Invitation to finally, with the specific gravity and specific honesty that only the second half generates, engage with the interior life that the first half's external focus did not require to be engaged with. What does genuine engagement actually look like? Not the performance of psychological sophistication, not the adoption of a therapeutic vocabulary that allows the same avoidance to continue in a more educated idiom. Genuine engagement, the specific, personal, often uncomfortable, always ultimately worthwhile process of turning honest attention toward what has been most consistently avoided. It looks like the willingness to ask genuinely and without the immediate protective rush to answer, who am I beneath the roles I have been performing? Not the professional identity, not the relational identity, not the identity organized around what has been achieved or survived or contributed, but the person beneath all of those, the one who was present before any of them were constructed and who has been present throughout, however successfully managed into the background. It looks like the willingness to feel, honestly, and without the management that the first half required, what is actually present in the interior life, the grief that has been accumulating, the anger that has been converted into more socially acceptable forms, the longing for something that the constructed life has consistently substituted for rather than provided, the specific, personal, irreplaceable sense of what would have made the life genuinely, not just functionally, meaningful. It looks like the willingness to let the question be as large as it actually is. The second half of life's central question, who am I really? And what am I actually here for? Is not a question that resolves quickly or cleanly, or through any single conversation, however honest. It is a question that unfolds over time, revealing itself in layers, each layer requiring the kind of patient, compassionate, genuinely curious attention that the first half's focus on resolution and forward movement rarely cultivated. And it looks, eventually, like the willingness to live from the answers that the genuine engagement produces. Not the answers that the social world endorses. Not the answers that the first half's organizing concerns would have predicted. But the answers that arise from the honest, sustained, compassionate encounter with the genuine self that the second half's work makes available. Gabor Maté believed and demonstrated through his own life's later chapters that the second half of life, when it is genuinely engaged with rather than avoided or endured, can produce something that the first half, for all its energy and achievement and external productivity, almost never produces. A quality of genuine presence, a quality of authentic relationship with the actual life being actually lived, a quality of real, settled, not requiring external confirmation, aliveness that the performance-organized first half self, however successful its performance, simply did not have access to. He arrived at this not as a spiritual theory, but as the clinical observation confirmed by his own personal experience. He watched people in the second half of their lives who had genuinely engaged with this invitation emerge into something that he could only describe as more genuinely themselves than they had been at any previous point. Not happier in the simple sense, not free from difficulty or loss or the ordinary suffering of a human life continuing to be lived, but more genuinely present to their own existence, more honestly inhabiting the specific, personal, irreplaceable life that was actually theirs. That emergence is available to everyone in the second half of life. It does not require extraordinary circumstances or extraordinary psychological sophistication. It requires the one thing that the second half's invitation is specifically designed to cultivate, and that the first half's organizing concerns so consistently worked against. The willingness to stop building for a moment and simply, honestly, with genuine curiosity and genuine compassion, to look at what has actually been built, and to ask, with the specific courage that genuine honesty in the second half of life requires, whether what is there is genuinely yours. And the privilege of a lifetime, understood not as a motivational phrase, but as the honest, clinically grounded, personally verified conclusion of a person who spent 50 years watching human beings either take or defer this invitation. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not in the first half, where the developmental tasks point elsewhere, but in the second, where the invitation finally arrives, where the question finally becomes unavoidable, where the genuine self, having waited with extraordinary patience through the first half's necessary but ultimately insufficient organizing concerns, finally has the conditions it requires to become genuinely, fully, irreversibly known. That is what the second half is for. That is what Gabor Maté understood about it that almost no one else says clearly. And that is what is available to you in whatever stage of the second half you're currently navigating right now.